As you can see, I have an Italian last name. I'm not like 100% Italian, but I'm a bit Italian, so I tend to talk with my hands and be a little bit animated. And if that finds me back here, I'll try to rein it in, and so you could hear me. So I know we just had lunch. I am almost in a food coma, but I'm trying to power through and get the energy and enthusiasm to come through the next section here. But I've been told that I do have a bit of energy and enthusiasm for the topic, so I think I'll try to channel that in the next half hour. So yeah, what I'll be speaking about is, I gave a little preview on one of the many programs that we run through the RDN's Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program. And I've been working with the program since 2011, and I think it's safe to say we've really come into our own in that time, and there's some really great things that I want to share in terms of the model that we're employing at the regional district level, how we came to be, how the program came to be, and some of the success stories that we can share about our collaborative projects. So our region, I know I started my last little section with that, but I wanted to bring this up again. So our region, the Regional District of Nanaimo, is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish First Nations. It's comprised of 7 electoral areas and 4 member municipalities. So we've been through all this before, but that's a good map to sort of splash up what I would call is the jurisdictional boundaries. Now in terms of water provision or water purveyors, so where people get their tap water from, in our region, each municipality provides drinking water to their residents separately. So we've got separate drinking water systems, one in each of our municipalities, so Nanaimo, Lanceville, Parksville, and Qualicum Beach. In the electoral areas, the RDN operates 9 small systems spread out in some of the electoral areas. Improvement districts provide water also in waterworks districts to places within the electoral areas, but a lot of people are on private wells. And so it's suffice to say that within our region, we rely heavily on groundwater for our community water supply, as well as surface water. So the next boundaries I'm overlaying on the map here are what we call our water region boundaries. So the idea here is that, watersheds, the way water flows, ecological boundaries, it looks different than when you lay the jurisdictional or political boundaries on a map. And so for planning purposes and for sort of the conceptual purposes of packaging our region into sub-regions or water regions based on water flow, we look at it as Big Qualicum Water Region, Little Qualicum Water Region, French Creek Water Region, Englishman River Water Region, Nanoose to South Wellington Water Region, Nanaimo River Water Region, and Gabriola Island Water Region. And so to point out here, it's essential to understand that water is not confined to those political boundaries. Water is not just truncated at the City of Parksville district or municipal line. There's the upstream area of the electoral areas that all flow downstream into the coastal municipalities. And so it's important to manage our water and understand our water resources on this regional scale. And so that's the purpose of sort of laying those water regions on the map there. So we've heard this word assets, it's come up throughout the discussion, throughout the symposium, and I think it's really important that we do use that language when we're talking about our watersheds, because they truly are assets to our communities. Watersheds are essentially the area of land that we live on. It's an area of land that drains to a common artery or common river or creek, right? So no matter where you are, you're in a watershed. You might be in the upper watershed if you're standing up on Mount Arrowsmith. You might be in the mid-watershed if you're in the Arrington-Coombs area, and then you'd be in the lower watershed if you were on the beach at Rathtrevor, for an example, if I was talking about the Englishman River watershed. So watersheds are assets in the sense that they provide our community water supply, so our drinking water that comes out of the taps, that's essential for our communities. But beyond that, they provide our ecosystem values, and they provide recreational opportunities and spiritual and cultural values as well. So I think anyone from our region, if you got into a conversation with them, what do they like to do? What are they passionate about? What do they like about where they live? I think if you talk to them long enough, you would hear something about water. It's a really integral part of our communities and our quality of life on Eastern Vancouver Island. So while our watersheds are really important assets in our communities, they're under stress at the same time. So we can look at some stressors kind of tipping the scales in terms of climate change impacts. So we have a photo there of Martindale Road that's subject to pretty much annual flooding that's actually getting worse when we're seeing these short duration, really intense rainfall events. And then beside that, you see the other end of the spectrum, which is trying to capture the idea of winter drought, or the reality of winter drought. When this is winter of 2014, I believe, and that's Mount Arrowsmith, and it was record low snowpacks for our region. And what that translated to was in the coming summer months, wasn't that built up water storage that we like to see and that we rely on by having snowpack. So that, the impacts of floods, but also of drought within our region due to climate change impacts. We're also a growing region, a great place to live, lots of folks coming to enjoy what we have to offer here. But again, that does put stress on our environment, and it results in land use change, so more development going on, as well as there's resource extraction and other activities that are constantly changing our landscape, and that results in watershed stress in some instances. So if we have one scale tipping over here with the environmental stresses, how do we manage that and tip the scales and get back into balance? And there are management challenges in the sense that it's limited resources. Any one agency isn't resourced enough to handle anything on their own. And we recognize that, and that is something that is a really big central piece to managing our water resources in the region, is looking at what can we do with limited resources. And the answer has always been, let's leverage partnerships, let's collaborate, because what we have together is much greater than we have if we go it alone. So looking at these stresses, I have to point to the foresight of the Regional District Board in the early 2000s. So understanding the stresses of climate change, population growth, rapid land use change, and realizing that we don't really have enough information to truly inform the best decisions in our region at that time, the Regional District Board put their heads together and said, we need to come up with a way to address these stresses. And that was at the point where the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Steering Committee was formed. And again, it comes back to collaboration. So the steering committee had island health representatives, municipal representatives, DFO, we have, community members, we've got, provincial agencies all coming together to say, well, how can we address, the stresses that we're seeing and actually, actively pursue these strategic goals that were identified by our regional board to maintain healthy and adequate water supply, protect water quality and ecosystem values, and encourage innovative regional planning. So how do we do that? Well, that steering committee, through their work and with the help of Lanark, who are the consultants working on that project, developed over time, many years of hard work, but good work, came up with the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Action Plan. And so this is a document that kind of lays out a roadmap to say, okay, if we want to address better understanding and protection of water supply, better understanding of ecosystems and protection of ecosystem values, and really innovative planning for the future of our region to be prosperous, both economically and environmentally, here's a great plan of how we can do it. But then it begs the question, okay, great plan, how do we implement that, right? We don't want this to just be another plan that sits on the shelf and is a good read, but what's actually happening? And so this is also another piece of foresight where it's like, okay, let's put our heads together and come up with a way to meaningfully implement this good work. And the solution there was to come up with a regional service. And to do that, there's certain ways to do it, but the route that was chosen was to go to the electorate through referendum and ask the population, would you be willing to pay into a regional function that directly works on drinking water and watershed protection? And so in 2008, and I'll point to John Finney because he was integral in this as the general manager of the Environmental Services Department at the RDN at that time. And so it's risky. It's like, okay, you're going to the electorate, you're putting a referendum question out there, yes or no, and this is like a pivotal moment. And so, with a small margin, granted, the answer was yes, But that gave the RDN the ability to establish a parcel tax funded service to fund the implementation of this action plan. And just to give you an idea, it's about $8 a parcel, and it's paid into by all 7 electoral areas, as well as all 4 member municipalities. And so that really kind of exemplifies the watershed approach. It's not just the RDN, it's not just the city of Nanaimo or Parksville, it's like we're all working on this together because we share the same watersheds, same aquifers. And so when you look at our action plan, there's a lot in there, but I often distill it to these 3 key pillars. It's education, so the awareness building, the outreach within the community to understand more about our water resources. It's the science, it's collecting the data, doing the monitoring, performing the studies to better grasp the dynamics of our watersheds and our aquifers. And then on the foundation of these 2 elements, education and science, we are then better able to inform planning decisions, policy decisions, right? And so I nest them like this in this nice smart art. Thank you, Microsoft. But the reason I nest them this way is because I see them as very integral to each other, right? You can't have one without the other. And they strengthen and complement each other, these elements here. And we can deliver these things in a nested way through our service delivery as drinking water and watershed protection across the region. And so this is something I've come to discover through our work, is that our program, it seems to be a bit magnetizing. It draws partners in. And that's really interesting to me because I don't think, we never really necessarily set that out as like, we want to be a magnet for partnerships, but really that's what it's turned into. And I think part of this is because it shows commitment. It shows that the regional district is committed to a long-term plan for drinking water and watershed protection. It's not just a 1-year, grant-funded initiative that can do good work, but really when you look at our watersheds, our aquifers, our ecosystems, you need to look at the longer view. And by having a regionally funded service, it demonstrates that political support and the importance for these issues. And it's able to bring in and leverage contributions from provincial government, from stewardship groups and community groups. Municipalities, of course, pay into the program, from industry, forestry, federal government, so Geological Survey of Canada has brought project work to our area, magnetized through our program, academia, school districts. And so it's this durable, long-term funding source that demonstrates our commitment, but also shows, we don't think it's just up to us in our program to go and single-handedly. It's like, no, we will come to the table and we'll come with resources, but it also attracts, the other players, and we realize we all have something to contribute to water sustainability. So our program's called Drinking Water and Watershed Protection on Purpose. It's a pretty long name sometimes, and talking about acronyms earlier, that's one of them, DWWP, but it's on purpose because we didn't want to neglect drinking water for watersheds, and it's trying to capture both the community water side of things, but also the ecosystem value, right? So drinking water and watershed protection. And if we think about water-centric planning in general, there's these elements that come together. So it's looking at water supply for our communities, but also habitat values, aquatic ecosystems, and also the cultural values of our waterways, the land use impacts on our water, and then the stormwater and the drainage elements. So there's lots going on. But that is why we need to nest with these different partners, whether that's the province, First Nations, industry, and municipalities, to tackle such a large scope of issues and topics. So I like this illustration. Normally you see that sort of overview map, but this is an illustration of our region, kind of truncated there, just looking actually at the Nanaimo River, and you can see the Millstone River faintly in there as well. But what I'm just trying to illustrate with this drawing here is that, our landscape covers all these spheres. So I could say, okay, you've got land use going on here. There's the cultural values nested in the landscape. You can see the water supply for the city of Nanaimo up at Jump Lake and South Fork Dam, which is actually outside of the watershed that the city's footprint is within. So we're in the Millstone River watershed right now, but the drinking water comes from outside of this watershed in the Nanaimo River watershed. So even just there, it's showing that cross-jurisdictional nature of our water. And what we do on the land matters. So this is kind of picking up on a thread that Kim has really instilled. So I'm halfway through, kind of built my kind of context And now I'm just going to kind of frame with this is bit of my thesis statement, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of the specifics of our collaboration successes. But I love this topic of restorative development, but I really think where we're at right now is actually restoring, and it's cut off. That's okay. So to get to restorative development, I really think we need to work on restoring, and in some cases initiating, healthy partnerships. And once we restore those partnerships, that gives us the foundation to do this innovative work on restorative development. So meaning not just preventing damage, or not just protecting, but enhancing and providing more cumulative benefit. I think that's a great thing to aspire to, but there's no way you're going to achieve such a lofty goal without very healthy, restored, and sustainable partnerships. And that's what we're really focusing on with our program. So I'm going to list off a few of our success stories. The idea kind of building off of this hard work of hope. It's been really hard to establish these things. It's taken time. We're about almost 10 years into our program, so we actually have a lot of great things to report out on. It's been hard work, but I think it really inspires hope for what we can do when we work together. So first off, I just want to highlight that steering committee I mentioned in the formation of our action plan is now actively our technical advisory committee that helps oversee our implementation of the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Action Plan. And so it's a laundry list here. I know it's just text, but it's to illustrate all the players that sit around the table and contribute guidance, oversight, their expertise, for our regional initiatives on education, on the science, on the policy and planning. So some key initiatives to highlight under science and monitoring. I spoke this morning in our 5 to 10 minute short presentation on the Community Watershed Monitoring Network. So I won't go into too much more detail here, but the key message being that through collaboration with stewardship groups, the province, and private forestry, we're able to really expand the data set we have on surface water quality in the region. A key update I wanted to share is that we have up to 7 years of data from some of these sites, and we're taking the entire data set from 2011 to 2017, and this year we're engaging in a trend analysis for that entire data set, so working with consultants to look at the trends in the different creeks and watersheds in terms of water quality, but also overlaying land use change information and data, precipitation and climate data, and stream flow data for really a holistic look at, okay, here's our big data set, what are the trends we're seeing in the creeks and rivers across our region, and resulting from that, what are some recommendations moving forward in terms of planning and policy, in terms of targeted outreach, in terms of a whole suite of things that we can do to address that once we have that analysis. So I know that was mentioned, it's like you can collect the data, but you also need to do the analysis, do the interpretation so it translates to something on the ground. I've also been getting questions about, oh yeah, it's good about surface water, but I haven't heard anything too much about groundwater today. So I will point to, we are doing some really great work in terms of expanding our groundwater monitoring in the region. And we've been able to expand the provincial observation well network from previously 14 monitoring wells within our region. We added an additional 16 through our program. So we were able to get grant funding to support that between 2011 and 2013. So an additional 16 provincial monitoring wells. And further to that, so this is the stewardship and the community element, is we've worked with private well volunteers. So individuals who have private wells that are in target areas, send a letter, would you like to participate in our monitoring program? And we've been able to add 30 volunteer monitoring wells to continue to expand the monitoring of groundwater levels in aquifers across our region. And that then improves our understanding of groundwater in relation to surface water because the two are connected. Hydrometric and climate monitoring is another avenue we've been pursuing through partners, working with DFO and with Ministry of Forest and Natural Resource Operations. I wanted to give a shout out to Lauren Fegan and Joe McCallum, two of our awesome staff people in the room who've worked on this program over the years. And I'm gonna make you guys stand up and give a wave, and most of you guys know them, so Lauren and Joe wouldn't be able to run these programs without them. All right. So science and monitoring, really important to get that data. But it's also really important to continue the engagement and awareness building within the communities. And so our program is also able to do that through, I was mentioning before, our Team Water Smart. So Lauren and Joe have also worked on that throughout the years. And that's through field trips, so taking students to actually see where their drinking water comes from in partnership with the forestry companies and with the municipalities. We're able to offer online resources, workshops, including workshops for well owners, so private well owners to understand more about how to maintain and protect their water source, again, through partnerships with Island Health and Ministry of Forest, Land, Natural Resource Operations. Also, a key element is our rebate programs. So it's good to provide information, but on top of that, providing incentive for action. So it's been proven, you can read a brochure and you can be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But that won't necessarily change your behavior if it's not addressing some barriers. So some barriers can be financial barriers, convenience barriers, those sorts of things. So we're trying to diminish those barriers in terms of financial barriers to encourage things like rainwater harvesting. So we offer rebate programs for residents installing cisterns for rainwater harvesting of 1,000 imperial gallons of storage and more, efficient irrigation upgrades, as well as well water testing and wellhead improvements. So all this foundation of education, awareness, the data and the monitoring leads us towards where we're really building towards with our program in the coming years, and we have moved in that direction so far as well, but that is the planning support and the policy advocacy. And so we can apply this local science directly to decision making at the local level. That might translate into information for our regional growth strategies, our official community plans, our policies, bylaws, development permit areas, so that we're taking a science and knowledge-based approach to policy. And also we can tailor those policies to the nuances of different areas. So we don't necessarily have to blanket one policy all across the region. We can say, okay, the aquifers and the streams in this part of the region have these characteristics and maybe require these types of policy interventions. So we can be more applied and more local in our prescribed policies and planning support. But it's not just at the local level. It's also through the provincial government as well, because they are the freshwater regulators. And so, I hear this, it's just downloading from the province. And, I would actually spin that around and say, we're not actually trying to take on what the province is doing. They're still the freshwater regulators. They oversee groundwater licensing. They oversee, setting water objectives, setting regulations for environmental flow needs and groundwater protection. But what we're doing as a region is saying, okay, those are the decision makers and these are the regulators for freshwater, and they're beholden to make decisions with the best available information. So we can advocate for our region by providing better information to the provincial regulators, so that therefore that translates into better decisions that affect our region. So it's kind of that advocacy role. If we were to step back and say, the province has got it, then we'd only have 3 water quality monitoring sites on the creeks and streams. We'd only have 14 monitoring wells. And there'd be a lot of neglected areas that wouldn't have that resolution of information and data, and therefore wouldn't have a chance of having better decisions made in those areas. So we really see it as, it's that collaborative piece. It's not about downloading. They're still a regulator. We'll leave that with you guys, but we will funnel information up so better decisions are made. In summary, yes. Okay, so in summary, on a foundation of public awareness, couple that with bringing in the local data and science, then we're better able to support decision-making in a collaborative way, and that will support a sustainable water future in our region. So I mentioned briefly we are coming upon the 10-year anniversary of our program implementation. It was first implemented in 2009, following that successful 2008 referendum. And at this juncture, we're looking at reviewing and updating our action plan. And we're going to be engaging the public between 2018 and 2019 and working with the regional board and partners across the region to look at our program, look at the successes, what we've been able to do. But now we have the opportunity to build on that foundation, integrate the latest science, adapt to the new regulations and new situations we find ourselves in, and kind of take it to the next level. So I'd encourage folks like you who have the interest to come join a Water Symposium to look out for the public consultation we'll be doing on our action plan update, again, between summer 2018 and summer 2019. It's going to be exciting. So lastly, I want to just end on this slide, and it shows a little bit of a cross-section of the different projects we have going on, whether that's the creek monitoring with volunteer stewardship groups, whether that's working with private forestry and taking folks up into the watershed on field trips, or working with local municipalities and improving, our understandings of where the drainages are and what our understanding of water quality is and aquifers and groundwater as well. And it's the collaborative process that really gets me energized. It's nice to see a lot of folks in the room that I hope to continue working with over the coming years. And thanks for the opportunity to present to you guys today. That's it.
Into the stream so it can be conveyed away. So the funding is provided by the agencies you see here. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of in-kind services provided by people who found data that we needed or answered questions or met and so on. So our appreciation to all of them. So a guiding philosophy is that use and conservation of land are equal values. So how did I get on this path? As Richard mentioned, I was the executive director of the Real Estate Foundation, I have to admit, for 22 years. Back in 1993, I was in my third year, 92, I was in my third year of that position. And I was looking at the Real Estate Act, which says very narrowly that the foundation would support nonprofit endeavor related to land use and real estate. Very traditional ideas. And land is defined as the ground and whatever improvements are on the ground. And it struck me, well, why aren't we talking about the land and whatever natural assets are on the land? So I spent a year convincing the governors that we should adopt a philosophy at the foundation, which was that use and conservation of land are equal values. And from that point on, the foundation began to fund work in the stewardship and conservation sector. At that time, too, I think it's important to mention that green infrastructure ideas and practices were just getting underway. And we've seen those evolve over the last 20 plus years, almost 30 years now. So a question I've been asking is, if we know how to do a much better job of protecting ecological features in our communities and our landscapes, why aren't we doing a better job? Why are we still seeing streams being degraded? Why do we still see practices that are embedded in land use policy and regulation that are 50 years old at times? How do we change that? I think the evolution of green infrastructure ideas is what we're witnessing now with increased stewardship activity, with the launch of the Municipal Natural Capital Initiative program. And Manny Machado was introduced earlier. Pinhole him for questions you might have about that program. And also with the Ecological Accounting Protocol demonstration, we're trying to move in the direction that you would expect green value activity to go. I guess I should just emphasize, I mean, this is the goal we're trying to get to, that we would have our settlements in balance with ecology so we're not degrading what we depend on. Okay, the purpose of the Ecological Accounting Program. In so many words, create an account of the worth of the ecological services of a creek shed produce or provide, and the extent to which stakeholders recognize the services and make use of them. The objectives of the Ecological Accounting Program are to prepare a creek shed profile, carry out an analysis of creek shed hydrology using the water balance methodology, identify measures that will reduce or avoid loss and improve the quality and amount of ecological services that may be drawn from the hydrology of the watershed or creek shed, review stakeholder views about risks and opportunities concerning the creek shed ecological systems, describe and to the extent possible quantify the worth, expenditures, donated labor, expertise, leverage funding, and so on, of measures are works and strategies undertaken by stakeholders to protect and enhance ecological systems. Finally, produce some kind of a proxy statement about that would be useful to municipal departments, especially that are undertaking budgeting that may involve natural assets, and also for their asset management strategies. How can stakeholders use the ecological accounting profile findings? There's quite a list here, but I'll go through them quickly. It produces a creek shed profile. So that's the historical condition of the watershed. It produces the water balance analysis of the watershed or creek shed hydrology. It assesses the condition of the ecological services dependent on that hydrology. It suggests a strategy to improve ecological services and support plans for specific projects, which will address statutory, mission-driven, and social cultural mandates. It suggests adoption of a process whereby stakeholders, including local governments, integrate policy and projects and initiatives in the watershed. And this is very important where watersheds or creek sheds typically lie in more than one jurisdiction. If one party is doing something and the other isn't, there will be conflicts. A management and maintenance plan be undertaken by the stakeholders. And here management means the enhancement of the creek shed, and maintenance means preventing degradation. A process to calculate the worth of potential projects and works, so is it worth doing? And an accounting of financial expenditures for projects as they are undertaken, and a creek shed management strategy which supports the local government asset management work. So in this research, we looked at two case studies. One is Shukswela Busy Place Creek in the Cowichan Valley Regional District and Cowichan Tribal Lands. It's just south of Duncan. The other is, we'll see it shortly, Brooklyn Creek, which is in the Comox Valley, and it flows through city of Courtenay, the regional district, and the Comox, town of Comox. So Busy Place Creek, it's 2 hectares in area. It's 32% industrial land use, 30% residential, 28% agricultural, 10% First Nations. So what we've learned, on my glasses so I can see that. What we learned in our profile is this creek shed's like many creek sheds on Vancouver Island. 150 years ago it was forested. Now it's it's under multiple uses. The hydrology's been altered by forestry, roads, urban, rural development, industrial uses like gravel mining, agriculture, and so on. In the case of Busy Place Creek, I'll see if I can use this pointer. Okay. The lower part of the creek is on the edge of the Cowichan estuary, so it's in a floodplain. And the upland areas here are, it's not a very high elevation. It falls maybe 150 meters altogether. So this is residential in this area primarily. Cowichan tribes lands in this corner and down in the bottom. So the headwaters and then where Busy Place Creek meets the Coxsila River is in Cowichan tribal lands. There's agricultural uses in this area primarily, and more or less that area is agricultural. That's the industrial park. And there's gravel mining on this perimeter down here. The gravel mining is deep enough that it's into the water table. So some of the water that used to come into this creek shed is now going to a different creek shed. So it's quite a lot of alteration. When we applied the water balance model, what we found was if the retention were increased in the watershed, the rainfall retention, that would enhance a number of ecological services that the stakeholders are concerned about or would like to access. So those are the sorts of things they're concerned about are, in general, more rural development, which would affect the hydrology. Flooding is an issue. Lack of water in the summer for firefighting is another kind of issue. Whether or not there's enough water for fish down in the lower part of the creek shed. And also they're concerned about water, the contamination of water that comes from roadside ditches that goes into the stream without being cleaned through another small wetland area or some other means. In our analysis, we found that if there were 3 areas where there were wetlands, that's number 1, number 2, number 3. They're remnant wetlands now, but they're in agricultural areas. These 2 are primarily ephemeral now. They exist for a little bit in the spring and then they're gone. It's only forage crops that's growing on them, so it'd be easy to convert those back to wetland areas. And if that were done, along with this one, the third one, which is down in here, if those were enhanced and returned to use as primarily wetlands, the retention in the creek shed could be increased quite a lot. That would have a number of benefits for riparian zones, for terrestrial and aquatic life. It would provide more nutrients going down to the floodplain. It would provide cooler water for fish, more water for fish in a longer duration of flow during the summer. So there's a number of benefits. We looked at the cost of putting in those wetlands, which are easily accessed areas, so they're low-cost work. The 3 wetlands could be installed at about 2.5 hectares, or say 4.5 acres total area, at a cost of around $100,000. So what's the stakeholder investment in Busy Place Creek? So stakeholders have done work on the creek. They've put in a refuge and spawning area for coho salmon and trout. They've done some remediation of areas where there was erosion. There's been a small bit of improvement on one private property and some other works. About $150,000 of cash has been invested over the last decade. There's quite a bit of in-kind involvement as well. And in addition, the stewardship sector, the stream keepers over 17 years, have invested about $277,000 of donated time and services. If we added these numbers together and then combined them with the $100,000 or so it would take to restore the wetlands, you'd get a total value of about $520,000. If you spent 1% of that a year, $5,200 to maintain it, would probably be enough to protect your sunk investment. If you wanted to improve it, you'd probably have to spend about 2% of your invested value to do that. So it just gives you a rough idea of the situation in that watershed and what the stakeholders think it is worth thus far by what they've invested. And with the aspirations they have, there could be a lot more uses. For example, Parks Department wants to put a trail along an abandoned rail corridor that goes up the valley. If the wetlands were put in, the creek shed was enhanced, the wetland areas or the riparian areas would be enhanced, much better environment for parks, would probably have an uplift on property values in the area because a certain amount of nature gets capitalized into real estate, those kinds of things. So there's also the importance of flood mitigation at certain times of the year, and these measures would also help to mitigate the potential of flooding. Left or spent? I think I better move along. The second project is Brooklyn Creek. It lies in 3 jurisdictions, as I mentioned. It's about 6 square kilometers in area. 1/3 rural development, 2/3 urban land uses. And the total distance from the top of the catchment to the outflow is about 10 kilometers. The condition of the watershed from the profile research. So the upper watershed lies in the city of Courtenay. It's almost totally developed for recreational, commercial, and residential. And it's a fully engineered area. The creek and headwaters area doesn't exist in a natural state. And there's an outflow at the boundary with the regional district, which is right there, that takes the collected water from the upper watershed area through the various engineered systems and delivers it across the border into the regional district, into the creek. The middle area, which is here, is in Area B of the regional district of Comox Valley. And it's an old rural subdivided area, could be further subdivided. It's a good example of most communities have a lot of zoning on the map that isn't built out, or that's built out that could be further subdivided. So communities are battling not what might happen in the future, but having to deal with what's already been put on the map, as it were, as potential development. This middle area is the best area for improving the retention in the watershed. When we ran the water balance model here to analyze it, there is no interflow really. It's all been vastly interrupted mainly by highways ditching along roads, by agriculture, by large private lots that have done various things on the land and so on. So the outcome of that is a lot of flow that used to go into the ground no longer goes into the ground. Instead it goes down the creek to town of Comox, which is down here. And for the town of Comox, that means dealing with threats from erosion, sedimentation, debris pileup, and some damage to private property if they don't manage it. So if we look at the stakeholder views about the watershed, in the upper watershed, the ecology's been subordinated to engineering and drainage systems. There's no parks in the watershed except one small one. The city of Courtenay doesn't intend to add any parks. The management of the actual drainage system is done by Crown Isle Development, and they don't plan any changes. So that's a kind of a lost part of the watershed. The middle watershed is by nature a reactive regime. That is, a regional district does not have authority over land use planning. That's in the hands of the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, where the regional district can have some authority is in development permit areas, and they have some. But changes are only driven when someone makes an application for subdivision or alteration of an existing property. So that could be redevelopment or infill. So to get any change in that part of the watershed, the middle watershed, the likely thing would be some kind of a strategic cooperation between town of Comox and the Comox Valley Regional District. The lower watershed is extensively developed. Also, the stakeholders have made extensive investment, I should say. So what happened was in 2005, the town was forced to deal with severe erosion problems, and they built a diversion structure to take 20% of the peak flow of the creek and pipe it directly to Cowichan Bay. So that was $1.98 million to put that in. At that time, they thought that maybe there was some management that needed to happen in order to avoid further expensive remediation. So they joined with the local Brooklyn Creek Watershed Society, the Parks Department, Engineering Department, and Current Environmental, which is a private firm that does a lot of biology consulting for clients in the Upper Island. They joined together and they devised a long-range plan to do restoration. Now, all of their restoration applies to lands that either the town of Comox owned or they could acquire to include in their strategy. So here's an example of some of the work they did. This is along the border of a property that at that time was owned by School District 71. And this is one example. Here they restored the stream corridor. So it was before a wide muddy ditch, and now it's a salmon area, salmon spawning, salmon habitat area. They acquired 2 acres from the school district for a nominal amount of $1. Probably the real financial value was about $300,000 an acre for this kind of land. This work was carried out by a parks budget and funds raised by the Watershed Society. The town of Comox got a pretty good deal here because there was a lot of leverage of funding. Parks, they've put in about $50,000 a year for the last 11 years into maintenance and enhancement work. About half of that budget comes through parks at the town of Comox, and about half is raised from outside funders through the town of Comox and the Watershed Society. So it's a lot of value for the investment. The other part of their strategy that has worked really well is the area on the right that isn't completed yet along the rail fence is a greenway segment, and there's a continuous greenway plan for the creek from where it enters the town of Comox to where it goes into the harbor. So local residents see this progress going on. They see the work being done, they see how it's done, they get to use the parks, they get to use the trails, they see it as part of their urban woodland strategy, nesting trees are protected, a lot of values. But they also accept that it's part of the town's drainage system, and it needs to be maintained as a natural part of the infrastructure, which is being done. So what made this work was a long-range strategy and annual work plans, the kind of collaboration that was involved, a focus on a package of ecological services so that people saw the benefits for ecology and they saw the benefits for land uses or the human settlement as being compatible and not in conflict. So the amount of investment in this case, $1,977,000 for the diversion, and to date about $796,000 of expenditures in kind and in cash to carry out 11 years of the enhancement and management plan. Future outlays for enhancement and other features. If they spend at least 1% of the capital value that's already sunk into the watershed, they would need to spend about $28,000 a year. Presently, they're expecting to spend about half of that, but a more real number might be 2%. So it gives you an idea that if you have these services, you want to maintain them, there's a cost to doing it, you can figure out what the cost, what your range of costs should be. Finally, we looked at the idea of valuing the stream corridor itself and the riparian zone. So here we have 2 properties on either side of the stream. There's a setback area, which is the width of the arrow, so imagine that going along the stream. So a certain amount of each property plus the stream corridor is in the commons. So what we did is we said, well, what if you analyze this setback area and calculate what it's worth? So what we did, there's a map, a GIS map of the stream, a section of the stream in the town of Comox. You can see how the green shaded area is the setback zone and it crosses a number of lots. So we took some of these lots and we figured out how much area is in what we call the common zone and what is the value of that area. And we came up with some numbers. So the value we got in total was the commons area at 50% of the value. We looked at about 8 properties. So that came out at about $500,000 of value, 50% of the assessed value. So we're using BC assessment numbers. The value per kilometer would be 2.7 million on this basis. And the 2.5 kilometers of stream that are in the town of Comox would be 6,763,000. If the town were managing all of that at 1% a year, they'd be spending $67,000 a year to manage the ecological services in the creek shed, riparian zone, and creek corridor in the town of Comox. And finally, the worth of a creek shed is a package of ecological services made possible by the hydrology. They're not separable. You can't deal with one without affecting the other. That's a very basic thing we've heard repeated a number of times today. And communities that don't understand that are leaving a lot of value on the table, and they're wasting a lot of taxpayers' money. So thank you very much.
So, as Richard said, I'm with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and I'm the Communications and Special Projects Coordinator with the Alliance. And for those of you who are familiar with us, we are a nonprofit initiative that basically works to build capacity of local groups who are working to protect their freshwater where they live. And we also do a few campaigns on policy topics across the country. So today I've been very interested to hear the different perspectives on the much needed and important topic of restorative development and watershed sustainability. And certainly this is a task that many in different sectors really need to get behind. So, we need the stewardship community, academia, different levels of government. And while it's certainly true that we need many on board, I think it's also true that some people have more of an ability to affect that change than others. And I know a number of you are here with local government today, and I think that local governments are very uniquely positioned to do this kind of work. They have power related to environmental protection and land use change within their jurisdictions. They have mandates, again, related to development and land use change. And they're the level of government that is the closest to the issues and also to the solutions. Many of them live where they work. And I also think that among, in particular, staff who are on the front line doing this work, there's a great deal of interest in sustainable watershed management. So today I'm gonna kind of flip what we've heard today and look at the other angle. We've heard a lot about the great work that's happening, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and in particular how the province might be able to play a role in addressing some of those challenges and gaps. So the presentation that I'm going to give is based on research that I conducted last year that involves several dozen watershed practitioners working with or for local government. And basically, I was working with those practitioners to do research, to hear their opinions, to find out what they thought was working and what wasn't working, and compile those findings into a summary report, which is available on our website, and I'll share that link at the end of my presentation. And so the impetus of that research was based on continuing work from the nonprofit Evergreen, which is based in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland, and they've been doing work on urban watershed sustainability with local governments and the stewardship community. And something that they found in that work is that local governments really wanted to know what BC's new water legislation, the Water Sustainability Act, would mean for them. So they applied for funding from the Bullitt Foundation, the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and then contracted us to look into that. So even though we have this bright, new, shiny legislation that was called into force in February of 2016, the Water Sustainability Act is what is called enabling legislation. So it sets out a lot of powers in different areas that the province can regulate, but a lot of the details and the teeth of how it will actually play out and be implemented on the ground really depends on regulation and different policy and funding levers. So with this research, we were really interested in building an empirical case for how, under that act, tools could be developed that really support local governments in their ability and in their capacity to sustainably manage watersheds that fall within their jurisdiction. And as I mentioned, we honed in on urban watersheds, which have pretty specific challenges, but that aren't explicitly acknowledged in the legislation. Sorry. But so in order to know what those tools could be, we first needed to find out what are the environmental challenges that local government practitioners are seeing in their watersheds, and why are they challenged to address them? So in other words, what are the management challenges? And then from there, we were able to look at the legislation and the kinds of powers that it assigns and develop some recommendations. So I mentioned the research with local government practitioners. So there are a few different ways that we gathered that research. There was a survey that was sent out to 79 folks in urban areas across BC. We got 35 responses. We also did some deep dive interviews to follow up on the survey responses with 5 practitioners and also 3 experts that aren't necessarily practitioners themselves, but are looking at the policy level or the broader picture. A literature review. We also had an advisory panel of 5 different people with different experience in water policy and watershed management. And then once I compiled all of the findings from that initial research, I held a webinar to kind of triangulate and corroborate what I found with the people that I interviewed and who did the survey. So 12 people were on that webinar. And then I took what I heard and compiled it into a final report, which then was reviewed by external reviewers. And then finally, we took the recommendations to a workshop where about 50 watershed practitioners and people from the stewardship community, First Nations, participated, and we workshopped those recommendations and put it in a final report. So very quickly, I'll just say what I meant by urban and watershed sustainability in this context. So urban, the definition that we used is at least 300 people per square kilometer. So the BC average is 4 people per square kilometer. Obviously, that's spread out through a very large area. And looking specifically at places with populations of 10,000 people or more. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the recommendations won't also be relevant to places with less density or with lower populations, but that was who we focused on. And in particular, we looked at municipalities and regional districts. So in the Metro Vancouver area, Eastern Vancouver Island, the Kamloops area, and the Okanagan. And then watershed sustainability, I mean, it doesn't lend itself so readily to a very operational definition, but based on what Bob brought up last night of the Brundtland report, the idea that environmental resources and ecosystems are conditioned such that the needs of both current and future generations can be met, and consequently that ecological and hydrological integrity is able to provide water in qualities and quantities that allow those needs to be met. So basically, we left how that was interpreted up to the practitioners who participated in the research. So I'm not going to get too much into some of the issues that we see in urban watersheds. We already talked about a lot of that today, and I know many of you are already quite familiar with this. So this was basically, it was based on the literature review. One very interesting statistic that I will say that I came across is it takes a very little amount of land use change to see pretty big impacts in the watershed. And one review in particular said that after about 5 to 15% of land use change in the watershed, there's significant declines in salmonid populations. And of course, all of these issues are then magnified by climate change. So I'll just get right into the survey responses. So the survey contained a variety of questions gauging opinion on the severity of environmental issues, perceived causes and barriers to addressing them. As I said, the respondents were from the Lower Mainland, so separated out Lower Mainland respondents from those living in more highly urbanized areas. Identified that as places with a density of 600 people per square kilometer or more, or moderately urbanized areas. Eastern Vancouver Island, we only had a couple, Kamloops and the Okanagan. And most of the respondents were with a municipality or a regional district, but we also had a few folks from collaborative partnerships or agencies, consulting firms that work with local governments, First Nation band or organization, municipality. And I'll just clarify that when I say local government in the context of this research, I'm really talking about municipalities and regional governments. First Nations, of course, do a lot of work that is very relevant at the local level and applies to the local level, but because they are nations, they have different realms of responsibilities and roles with regard to local government. So very different context. So I was looking specifically at regional districts and municipalities. So in response to the question, please rate the severity of the following environmental issues in your watersheds out of 5. These are the responses that we got. So as you can see, especially towards the left, there's much more red and orange than there is green and yellow. So they were asked to rate it out of 5, 5 being the most severe and 1 being not really a problem. And so by far the top 2 were riparian habitat loss. So 80% of people thought it was either a very big issue or a big issue, and droughts and or low stream flows. And then followed not too far behind by flooding. There was variation by region, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into too much here, but if you're interested, you can look at that in the report. A big one was drinking water quality was rated as very different issues in different places, and I think in particular the Lower Mainland, because they have protected watersheds, and in the interior they do not. So I think there was the most variation in responses with regard to that. So then we wanted to look at what are the underlying causes. So what are the pressures that are giving rise to these environmental challenges in the first place? So again, the question, please rate the severity of the following watershed threats or stressors in the urban centers where you operate. And here we see land use change as being rated the most salient pressure. Followed by impervious surfaces, which is of course related to land use change, but not necessarily a change. It might have been there from before. And climate change as being number 3. So we had 84% of respondents saying that land use change was either a very significant issue or a significant issue in their watershed. And again, some variation by region that I won't get into too much here. So, local government, we've been hearing about this all day. Local governments, of course, they have tools at their disposal to address some of these environmental issues, and a lot of local governments are doing really fantastic work in this regard. I'll just quickly go over some of the tools that do exist. So, of course, there's bylaws. We've talked about development permit areas today, zoning regulations. We talked about well, I don't know if we actually talked about water demand management programs today, but of course that's a tool for local governments that are also purveyors. We talked about funding mechanisms, so the regional district of Nanaimo has recently instituted their land parcel tax. There are a few other local governments that have also done some innovative funding structures as well. Something that is interesting to note, though, in this research, so there are federal and provincial grants available for infrastructure and for including green infrastructure. But despite the grants that do exist, over the years, more and more of the share of funding infrastructure has fallen to local governments. So in 1950, local governments contributed on average 27% to infrastructure investments. And by 2010, they were paying over 48%. So more and more of that onus is falling on local governments to fund that themselves. So starting to look now at what those management barriers are. So the question, can local governments adequately address watershed issues? The majority of respondents said some of them. Some of them said no, 18% said no, and the rest of people said either yes, or most of them, or unsure. Something that was interesting to note is I did a follow-up interview with someone who said, yes, we can adequately address watershed issues. And I asked him for clarification and why he thought that was, and he said, well, local government does, in theory, have the tools necessary, but those tools aren't necessarily always deployed or used. So in terms of barriers, again, the question rate 1 to 5. What do you think are the biggest barriers to addressing watershed issues at the local level? Okay, so you can't really see it in the graph here, but funding was rated, not surprisingly, number 1. Support from higher levels of government was rated as the second most salient barrier. And policies and standards that support local government was rated number 3. Interestingly, the least salient barrier was insufficient data and management. There was a few people, insufficient data and information. So there were a few people that said, we have the data, we know what we need to do, but it's not being done. So, so on the survey as well, there was also a comment section, and in the interviews, those were 45 minutes to an hour or so, and we were able to take that information, that qualitative information, in addition with the survey responses, and identify some kind of key themes or challenges that are hampering local government's ability to sustainably manage their watersheds. So. So first of all, this was brought up a few times in different ways, and it's basically the tension that voluntary protections don't always lead to outcomes. BC really has a very enabling approach to local government, the Local Government Act and the Community Charter. It gives local governments all of these powers to regulate, but there's not very much legislation that necessarily requires action to be taken. Of course, there are some exceptions like the riparian areas regulation or the sewerage regulations as well. But there was, the good is, of course, that it gives flexibility, and the not so good is that protections can be very uneven, and a lot is left up to the political will of the local organization or the local government. And so the idea of political will was brought up by a few different participants, and in particular, one interview we talked about how even if there is a requirement for something, like a plan, for example, if there aren't necessarily requirements for outcomes, then that plan might not necessarily be acted upon. So, their quote there, it's a plan, it doesn't mean it's a have to. I'm not going to talk about the solutions in depth here, just in the interest of time, but for every of the barriers identified, we also identified some of the solutions, and those solutions are also encompassed in the recommendations. So, number 2 was the idea of long-term planning versus short-term political cycles. This is not specific to watershed management in BC. It's kind of an existential question of environmental management everywhere. But it basically the idea is encompassed in that local governments are responsive to their constituents. They're under pressure to show value for money, and the beneficial impacts of a restoration project, they might not reveal themselves for as little as a few months to as many as decades, if not more. And local governments are under pressure to show their constituencies how that those public funds are benefiting the community on a much shorter term or risk losing elections. So there were a few folks that I talked to that showed some frustration that budgets or public agendas are maybe determined by what's politically palatable and not necessarily what's in the best interest of the community. A piecemeal approach. So the idea that many of the tools are very site-specific and that they pertain to future developments, but not necessarily looking at the damage that's already been done or the degradation that's already happened. So here's a quote. Someone says that the current suite of tools are slowing down the loss, but it's very hard to move the needle forward. So this is really that restorative development issue that we've been talking about. So the tools are able to, for future developments require certain things, but not necessarily looking at the past. And I thought that, in particular, that could maybe explain, despite things such as the riparian areas regulations that are in effect, that local watershed practitioners are pretty concerned about the welfare of riparian areas, particularly in highly urbanized watersheds, because they've already been built out. And those regulations are looking at new developments. Not surprisingly, a lack of resources to support on-the-ground work. I mean, this was identified as the largest barrier in the survey. Someone said huge watersheds, so many stakeholders, no time, no funds. And interestingly, this pertained as much to local government as it did to provincial government. So there was quite a few people who mentioned that the provincial government themselves don't have the staff and the resources to adequately be able to fulfill their own duties, and sometimes that was a real source of frustration for local governments who were trying to, for example, work in collaboration with the provincial government or get a permit that they needed in order to do a green infrastructure project and was not hearing back, and or that the crown lands or upper watersheds are not being managed or enforced the way that they ought to be. And someone said here, I applaud the recent changes to the Act, but I feel that the province will be hard-pressed to respond to the new work that it will generate. And kind of drawing on this underfunding, understaffing issue was the idea of accountability of provincial and federal governments. So it was brought up to with regard to both level of governments, but more specifically came up with regard to the province, which makes sense because that is the province's mandate is watershed management. It was brought up unprompted, both in the survey and in the interviews. And again, local governments that I spoke with or that did the survey expressed frustration that it undermined their efforts to be able to protect and restore their watersheds. That the province wasn't necessarily enforcing existing water licenses or legal withdrawals. That the province was acting in a very reactive manner and not necessarily getting ahead of the issues. Number 6 was so this kind of uncollaborative decision making, as we already talked about a few times today. Watershed boundaries cross jurisdictional boundaries, and so sustainable watershed management requires partnerships and coordination between a lot of different levels of government and ample resources to be able to carry that forward. So there's concerns that local governments are constrained in some things and they can't do everything because not everything is within their jurisdiction to be able to do. But a few participants talked about how provincial and even federal participation in local watershed management was lacking and sometimes almost non-existent at the local level. There are a few folks that I spoke with that said that the province used to come to the table and stop showing up. And when I held the forum in October, we did have provincial representatives there, and they also spoke to their frustration and that staffing had been cut, and so one person that used to be able to do that didn't have time anymore because they had more responsibilities as well. Another thing is that there's quite a bit of unevenness around BC with regard to what kind of collaborative watershed decision-making mechanisms exist. So, in some watersheds, there are actually formalized entities that have some kind of legal status, like the Okanagan Basin Water Board, for example. And in others, there's more ad hoc partnerships that come together, and in others still there aren't those partnerships, but maybe there might be an intergovernmental committee or what have you. And then finally, the last theme was that it's a fragmented and kind of complex framework in BC. I think the issue of conflicting mandates came up earlier today with regard to engineering standards, and so someone said, conflicting mandates to add source controls, it kind of comes into conflict with the BC Building Code. There's a lot of different acts and legislation that are regulating different things, and there's a lot of things that already exist. So there was a desire to make sure that the New Water Sustainability Act really is a vehicle or a mechanism to be able to foster that coordination, and that it doesn't kind of recreate the wheel. So there's already things that exist, such as water sustainability plans or water assessment and response plans. And so really the desire that if there's a new plan, it's not something entirely different, but that it coincides with all of these other different tools, and that it is able to bring those tools together. So I'll just kind of jump through the leverage points of the Water Sustainability Act. I'm sure there's a lot of different levels of familiarity and knowledge about the Act in the room, and kind of the powers that it does enable and lie out. But I'll just get right into the recommendation. So we identified 5 key areas of opportunity for regulatory and policy development, so not necessarily just regulation, but also looking at funding levers and policy levers and that as well. So those recommendations, they build upon the solutions for each of the barriers that I just discussed. And so there's 14 recommendations in total, and then there's sub-recommendations for each area. So the first area for recommendations is connecting land and water with water objectives. So the Water Sustainability Act has sets out a tool called water objectives, which can basically enable regulation around pertaining to water quality, water quantity, or ecosystem health. And so how those water objectives will play out, or what they're going to look like, that has yet to be determined. But there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm for water objectives as a tool, but people that were involved in the research, they really wanted to see them. They really wanted them to see them be performance-based and have a lot of flexibility for local context. To involve local governments and First Nations, to give legal precedence despite other enactments, to allow them to apply also to urbanized watersheds, and also that there is mechanisms in place to monitor and review water objectives, so that we know that they're being effective, that they're not just another regulation that's out there, but they're actually serving and doing what they're supposed to do. So the second area was improving coordination and transparency in watershed decision making. So this includes things like developing guidance and processes for local government on how the watershed decision making will be affected by the Water Sustainability Act. Developing water governance pilots in priority areas, which could form the basis for watershed entities, so these watershed governance mechanisms. And actually, since I've written this, the government has announced recently a watershed governance pilot in the Nicola region with the Nicola First Nation. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. Things like establishing a third-party capacity building entity to coordinate and facilitate knowledge transfer between watershed entities and different levels of government. And when water sustainability plans are designated, ensure plans consider and incorporate the efforts of previous watershed planning efforts, local government community plans and bylaws, so that they're really intersecting with the work that's already been done and, again, not recreating the wheel. Securing adequate funds for watershed management. So a big one here is looking at the current rate structure and the fees set out in the water sustainability fees, charges, and rentals regulations, and seeing if that if the revenue raised through that is enough to adequately implement the act and the extra work that it gives rise to. And another opportunity here is working with a sustainable funding task force to explore and test implementation of other sustainable funding mechanisms for watershed management. Ensuring water is protected for nature, so looking at establishing legally enforceable regulations to protect environmental flows. And also the possibility of developing an environmental flows task force with the participation of local government, First Nations, and the federal government. So monitoring and reporting on watershed health. So require all water users to monitor water withdrawals and report their use to government. And then compile a summary of water data into a state of our waters report that's publicly accessible and issued on a regular basis, so we're suggesting every 5 years. And the government did commit back in 2008 to doing a state of our waters report that would include all of that information, and unfortunately we haven't seen that yet, so this is a gentle reminder that this might be a great thing for people working in the stewardship sector and local government to be able to see that data and that big picture. And of course, looking at identifying opportunities to coordinate and streamline water data from different monitoring operations around the province to enhance knowledge sharing and reduce duplication of effort. So this is something that we've talked a bit about today already. There's a lot of great work being done in terms of citizen science. So how can that really be supported and streamlined? And yeah, so that's it. I've come in just under 30 minutes, and I'm happy to take a couple questions if you have them. The report is much longer than my presentation, but it is available on our website if you're looking at more information.